If you're a fan of haunted houses, you know that sometimes the things that haunt us aren't the obvious ones. They don't always come with creaking doors or shadows moving in the corner of your eye. Sometimes the things that terrify us are hidden, and sometimes the house we move into is hiding something that refuses to stay buried. This is the story of a family that moved into their dream home only to discover that sometimes dreams are nightmares in disguise. And what was waiting in the depths of their new house would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It all started when my family and I moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere. We were looking for peace and quiet, a fresh start after years of city living. We found the perfect house, a large, old Victorian-style home with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a sprawling yard. It seemed perfect, especially for my little brother, and my parents were eager to settle into the countryside. I was 16 at the time, and I'll admit I didn't share the same enthusiasm. I didn't want to leave my friends behind, but I put on a brave face. I wasn't going to ruin my parents' happiness over something trivial. But from the moment we moved in, something felt off. At first, it was small things. A door creaking open by itself, footsteps when no one was around, that feeling of being watched. My little brother Jason, who was 8 at the time, seemed to be the most affected. He was always talking about seeing shadows in the corners of rooms or hearing whispers when he was alone. But my parents chalked it all up to him being a kid with an active imagination. I, however, felt it too. I noticed things that didn't quite make sense, like how one of the doors in the hallway was always locked, even though it wasn't listed in the house's blueprints. At first, I didn't think much of it, but over time, it became something that nagged at me. I'd pass by it every day, and the locked basement door would silently call to me. I started having strange dreams about it, dreams that felt like warnings. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'd just narrowly escaped something terrifying. One night, I decided to check out the door. My curiosity got the better of me. I was alone, everyone else in the house was asleep, so I grabbed a flashlight and approached it. The door was old, with dark wood that looked out of place compared to the rest of the house. The locks were rusted, and the handle felt sticky as if it hadn't been touched in years. I was going to leave it at that, but then something caught my attention. I looked closer and saw faint scratches on the wood. Scratches that didn't seem like they belonged there. It looked like someone had tried to claw their way through it from the inside. It was odd. I couldn't stop myself. I ran to the garage, grabbed a crowbar, and returned to the door. My hands were shaking as I forced the crowbar under the door handle and pried it open. The lock snapped with a loud crack, and the door creaked open. What I found inside was nothing like what I expected. The basement wasn't a normal basement. It was vast, much larger than the house should have allowed. As I shone the flashlight inside, I saw piles of old furniture covered in dust, bookshelves filled with decaying old tomes, and in the center, an altar. It was made of stone, large and covered in strange, disturbing symbols. The room felt cold, despite the summer heat outside. And the air was thick, like it was trying to suffocate me. I took a step forward, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I scanned the room. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A symbol on the floor, etched into the stone tiles. It was like a pentagram, but twisted with lines that curved and looped in ways that made no sense. I felt like I had just stumbled upon something ancient, something meant to stay hidden. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it. Soft at first, like whispers from behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw nothing, but I could feel it. The air was heavy, pressing down on me. And then Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move. I turned around. Standing beside the bed was Trevor Necros. Trevor Miller was on his hands and knees, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around and saw what looked like a shadow move. I bolted up the stairs and slammed the door shut behind me. The basement door creaked as if something was pushing against it from the other side. I locked it, my heart racing. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't ignore it. The next day, I started researching the house's history. The local library didn't have much, but there were old newspaper clippings that talked about the house's first owner, a man named Richard Ellis. He was a recluse, never seen by anyone in the town. Rumor had it he dabbled in the occult, performing strange rituals in the house. There were whispers of people disappearing in the area around the time he lived there. But when the authorities went to investigate, they found the house abandoned, with no trace of Ellis or anyone else, just the remnants of whatever he'd been doing. The more I read, the more I understood. The basement wasn't just a room. It was a place for something far darker. The house had been abandoned for decades, but something was still there. Something had been waiting. That night, I decided to tell my parents. I felt like they needed to know, even if they didn't believe me. But when I went to their room, I saw that my mom and dad were already awake. My mom looked pale, and my dad had a concerned look on his face. "A tragedy." "Are you okay?" my dad asked. I nodded, but then my mom spoke, her voice trembling. "It's Jason. He's been talking about a shadow man in the house. He says it's in the basement." That's when I knew I wasn't crazy. Something was in that basement, and it wasn't just my imagination. That's when we came across the body of Alice. We gathered the tools, the crowbar, the flashlight, and the courage to face whatever was in that room. But as we stood in front of the basement door, something strange happened. The air turned cold, and the house began to shake, like a low growl was reverberating through the walls. The floorboards creaked, and the whispering came again, louder this time. We didn't have a choice. We had to open the door. We broke the lock, and this time, as the door creaked open, there was no going back. Exercise is a great medicine for the mind. The basement seemed even darker than before. The altar was still there, but now it felt alive. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, and the air was thick with a palpable energy. And that's when we saw it. A figure. It was a shadow, moving along the walls, stretching unnaturally, vanished. The ritual Ellis had performed had been interrupted before it could be completed. And now, if we didn't finish it, the entity would never leave. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only option. I took the book I'd found in the attic, flipping through the pages as the shadows closed in around us. I muttered the words, shaking with fear. But as I did, the entity screamed. It didn't want to leave. It didn't want to be banished. We fought back as best we could, but the entity wasn't just a shadow. It was something far more powerful. It clawed at us, trying to pull us into the darkness, but I kept reading, trying to finish the ritual. Finally, with one last chant, the room fell silent. The shadow dissolved, and the house went eerily still. We ran. We didn't stop until we were far away from that house. But even now, years later, I can't forget the feeling of that cold, suffocating air. The house was behind us, but the nightmare had followed. A few days ago, I found something in my bag. It was an old, rusted key, one I didn't remember seeing before. It's the key to the basement door. I thought we left that house behind. But I'm starting to wonder if the entity never really left. There's something eerie about a house that's too quiet. Something unnerving when you realize it's not just the silence that's unsettling, but the fact that someone or something else might be in it with you. Sarah and Ethan were about to learn this the hard way when they moved into their dream home, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life, only to find that their perfect retreat wasn't so perfect after all. Sarah and Ethan had spent the better part of a year searching for a house. They were a young couple, mid-20s, just trying to escape the noise of the city. They dreamed of a place in the countryside, somewhere quiet and peaceful. After countless disappointments, they finally found it. An old farmhouse secluded at the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was everything they'd ever wanted: space, privacy, and an old charm that made it feel like it could be their home forever. It stayed there for the first few days were blissful. They spent time unpacking, getting to know the house and enjoying the quiet. The house had been empty for a while, so there was still a faint smell of dust and old wood. It was exactly what they had hoped for, but little by little, things started to feel off. At first, it was small things. The lights flickered and doors would creak open when they were certain they had closed them. Every now and then, the floorboards would groan, like someone was walking around the house when no one was there. Sarah, more sensitive to the atmosphere, would sometimes get a strange feeling that they weren't alone. But Ethan laughed it off. "Old houses make noises," he'd say, trying to reassure her. But as the days went by, the weird occurrences kept stacking up. One night, Sarah woke to the sound of faint footsteps coming from the hallway. When she checked, she found nothing. Ethan was fast asleep beside her, and there was no sign of anyone else in the house. She shook it off, just the house settling, she told herself. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Then came the notes. One afternoon, Sarah was making the bed when she found a small folded piece of paper tucked under her pillow. At first, she thought it was a joke. Maybe one of the previous owners had left it there by accident. But when she opened it, she froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged, and the words seemed to make no sense. Sarah thought about it for a moment, then shrugged it off. It was probably some sort of prank, a weird thing left behind by the previous owners, or maybe some local kids messing with them. But then it happened again. The next day, Sarah found another note, this time tucked inside a drawer in the kitchen. It said, she showed it to Ethan, but he was just as confused as she was. He suggested they might be imagining things, but Sarah wasn't sure. She felt like something wasn't right, like there was someone else in the house with them. As the days wore on, the notes became more frequent, each one more cryptic than the last. They would find them in odd places, tucked inside books, under the couch cushions, even slipped into their coats. It was as if someone was watching their every move and communicating with them in these strange, unsettling ways. Ethan, now visibly concerned, decided to take action. He installed security cameras inside the house, thinking that maybe they'd catch the intruder on film. After all, they couldn't ignore it any longer, but when they checked the footage, their hearts sank. The cameras showed nothing, no signs of anyone entering the house. The footage just showed them, moving about the house, going about their daily lives. But then one night, the footage showed something they hadn't expected. In the dead of night, when both Sarah and Ethan were fast asleep, a shadowy figure appeared on the cameras. The figure was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes, and moved silently through the house. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. A person had been in their home. They immediately checked every room. All the doors were locked, the windows were secure. It didn't make sense. How had this person gotten in, and why hadn't they noticed anything? And the next day, Sarah decided to explore the house a little more. There was a section of the attic they hadn't yet checked out, and she was determined to see if she could find anything that might explain the strange happenings. When she went up there, she discovered something odd. Behind a pile of old furniture and dust, there was a small, hidden door. It was cleverly concealed, almost as if someone didn't want it to be found. Curiosity got the better of her, and Sarah opened the door. Inside, she found a narrow passageway leading deeper into the walls of the house. The walls were lined with cobwebs, and the air felt thick, heavy. She shone her flashlight into the darkness, her heart pounding. At the end of the passage was a small, dimly lit room. The room was empty except for a few old photographs and some personal belongings, clothes, shoes, and a pile of tattered blankets. There were also a few more notes scattered around the room. But it wasn't the notes that terrified Sarah. It was the photographs. They were old, black and white pictures of the house. Except these photos were decades old. And in every single one there was a shadowy figure in the background. Blurry but unmistakable, it looked like the same person who had been lurking in their house, who had been leaving the cryptic notes. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the photos. This was no coincidence. Someone had been living in the walls of the house, hiding, watching, and waiting for them to arrive. As she turned to leave, she noticed something else, a symbol etched into the floor, a twisted, almost occult-like design worn into the wood. Sarah didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was important. It was like a message, a warning. She rushed downstairs to tell Ethan everything she'd found. He was already looking through old records he'd managed to dig up at the library about the house's past. What he discovered shocked them both. The house had once been owned by a man named Richard Gray, a reclusive figure who had disappeared without a trace many years ago. The neighbors had always whispered about him, saying he was strange, that he'd spent most of his time alone in the house, and that there were rumors he had been involved in some sort of occult practices. But what really made their blood run cold was the fact that the house had never been fully abandoned. The police report from when Gray had disappeared mentioned no signs of foul play, and yet the house had been left empty except for the strange sounds and sightings reported by neighbors. Nobody had ever been able to explain it, and now it was clear. Richard Gray had never left. He had been living inside the walls of the house, watching, waiting for someone to come. And when Sarah and Ethan arrived, he saw them as his new guests. The notes, the rearranged furniture, the creepy photographs. It was all part of his twisted game. That night, they decided to confront the intruder. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, they went into the hidden room, the one behind the wall. As they approached the narrow passageway, they heard breathing, low, labored breathing. The air felt thick, as if something was watching them from the darkness. What a privacy. They moved slowly, each step more cautious than the last, until they found him, Richard Gray, the man who had been hiding in their house for years. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, and his hair was long and matted. He didn't speak. Instead, he stared at them with wild, uncomprehending eyes, muttering things they couldn't understand. Ethan tried to approach him, but Gray shrieked, lunging toward them with unnatural speed. He was desperate to keep them in his house, but with a few well-placed blows with the crowbar, they managed to escape and lock him inside the hidden room. They ran out of the house and called the police, but when the authorities arrived, they found nothing. Richard Gray was gone. The hidden room, the passageways, they were all sealed, as if nothing had ever been there. Ethan and Sarah never returned to that house. The police said the man had probably been living there for years, but no one could explain how or why. And to this day, the house stands empty, silent, with only the wind whispering through the trees. And sometimes, when the night is still, Sarah can swear she hears footsteps. The sound of someone still waiting.